arrogance.
Yeah. And all the
moralism.
And the third one, anyone guess? The prohibition.
Yes, legitimize.
And as we release this energy into the universe and we release ourselves, we go forth to proselytize that which we now know.
All right.
Start killing people and before they, to contribute their bodies, and that didn't make it. Even Christensen had to testify against Burke for allowing that to happen in his laboratory. The result, however, was for the first generation of British doctors to be really well trained in anatomy, in knowing how and where things were in the human body. In 29, he graduated from Edinburgh, very young age. He taught chemistry students, tutored them, so how they could get through Christmases and Burke's courses. Moved to London in 1830 and couldn't get a job. He couldn't get a license to practice medicine, even though he was very bright, because the doctors of London had a closed shop. Unless you were the son or daughter of a London doctor, you couldn't get a license to practice medicine in London, except unless you paid £10,000 sterling. And of course, for a graduate from medical school, we know what that's about. So he couldn't literally get a license. So he was in need of work, he needed a job, so he invented his own CSI lab. He'd studied with the best forensic toxicologist in the world, Robert Christensen. He sets up what amounted to a CSI lab. He analyzed blood, feces, urine, and bodily fluids of any type for the courts, for doctors, and for legal cases. And in fact, some of his work was used in the Burke and Hare trial. So that's a very good concept. I mean, you need work, set up your own CSI lab. This is 100 years before CSI labs were very common in the world. He started doing all these blood analyses of various victims of diseases, trying to figure out what the chemistry of the disease itself was. The very early pioneering effort here. In 1830s, the cholera epidemic broke out in London, which was very severe. They didn't know what caused cholera. It turned out 80 years later that it was caused by a vibrio. It's called Vibrio cholerae, but that wasn't even known at the time. All that was known was that people got cholera that thought to be people who had some connection with anybody who had returned from India. It was sort of like the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, where everybody had to be in certain groups or you couldn't get it, right? He started analyzing the blood of cholera victims. And in 1831, he wrote, I'll give this a quote. He wrote what a modern historian in Ireland has called one of the shortest and yet most significant letters ever sent to the journal, The Lancet. This was in the first 2 years of The Lancet, the British Medical Journal. And O'Shaughnessy simply sent them a very short letter saying, I've analyzed the blood of many cholera victims. It looks to me like they are suffering from acidosis, which means too much acid, lack of alkalinity, the same thing, and a lack of electrolytically balanced proper fluids. The reason the cholera kills people is because you shit out of every end. You shit and vomit, and you shit and vomit, and you shit and vomit, and you die. You become so dehydrated. I only have 5 minutes? Oh, I haven't even gotten the dope yet. All right, in 1831, he sent a letter to The Lancet discovering the modern treatment for cholera, which is the intravenous injection of electrolytically balanced fluids. It's exactly the same principle as modern athletes drinking Gatorade. It prevents dehydration from killing you, It immediately replaces the fluids with the proper electrolytic balance that your body needs. Published this. It was mind-bending because nobody knew what caused cholera. It was the 19th century equivalent of finding a cure for AIDS without knowing what HIV was. Amazing stuff. Kid's 21 years old. So he publishes this. The head of the Cholera Commission in London, it comes to the attention of this guy who had returned from India to head the Cholera Commission. He gives O'Shaughnessy, this poor Irish kid, a plum assignment. He assigns him as an assistant surgeon in the British East India Company. Now that's a plum assignment for British aristocrats. O'Shaughnessy goes over there in 1833, becomes professor of materia medica at the Calcutta Medical College that he helped to found. He starts learning Indian languages and some Middle Eastern languages. He talks with Ayurvedic physicians and Islamic physicians in India. And in 1839, he calls a little meeting of what was just a little college study group. It was called the Surgical and Physical Society, Medical and Physical Society of Calcutta. It was about 40 people, including some of his local sources who were the Ayurvedic doctors. Delivers a 40-page paper which changed our lives, all about the medicinal use of cannabis. He did the first clinical trials on cannabis ever in the world. First on animals to establish safety. Secondly, on human beings suffering from, let's get it exactly right, rheumatism, hydrophobia, cholera, tetanus, and convulsions. He immediately, within 2 days, cured a 40-day-old baby who had convulsions and was about to die. And he gave her a tincture of cannabis. He invented his own tinctures in India. That's what I feature him doing here. And we can go to the next slide. Yes. Oh, very good. Todd hated this picture when we made this picture out of his hero. A hippie artist in the 60s decorated it with a marijuana leaf on W.B. O'Shaughnessy's bench. And the truth of that picture is simply that he was the first to invent cannabis tinctures that are now commonly used in medical practice. So he published this little paper and got sick himself. He had published 3 other books at the same time in India, including the first Bengal dispensary and the first Bengal pharmacopoeia, and one of the first biochemistry books in the world, which was called A Manual of Chemistry. He wrote them in English for his Indian students. Very early examples of imperialist education that worked. And the reason it worked is because India has 360 different languages. And if you can find out Indian medical lore in English, that means that anybody can learn English. So it's a great example of early education in the science fields. He went back to England and took with him quantities of hemp for the Pharmaceutical Society and specimens of Cannabis indica, which were the first specimens they had for the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. This brought him attention to the Royal Society, which is the main scientific organization at the time in England. He was made a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1843. Sailed back to India and completely changed careers. A most amazing event. He had just turned on the Western world. All the chemists in England and Europe and America were vying with each other to make good tinctures. And that continued until 1964. Goes back to India, changes careers, becomes the assistant assayist for the Mint, inventing coinage that was standard throughout India instead of the hundreds of different currency systems they had in India at the time. In 1848, a man named Lord Dalhousie became the Governor General of India, and that really helped O'Shaughnessy because Dalhousie is the man who's remembered for the infrastructure of India. He built the railroads, the telegraph, the public education system, the postage system, and so forth. O'Shaughnessy proposed the idea of building a telegraph throughout India at a time when the longest telegraph in England was 18 miles long. So 18 miles long. So O'Shaughnessy wants to build a 3,000-mile telegraph in India full of electrical storms, all these disadvantages of having to cross rivers and swamps and bays and wild jungles and so forth. Convinces Dalhousie that this is possible, although it's obviously patently impossible to build a telegraph in India in the 1850s. Strings an experimental line between the port harbor city of Calcutta across the river Hooghly into Calcutta itself. It's longer than the longest telegraph line in England at 27 miles, and it works. It was the first underwater telegraphy in the world. Then he got Dalhousie to get him some funding from the British East India Company, help from 60 officers and about 150 Indian men to string telegraph as fast as he could across India. By 1854, he had completed 3,050 miles of telegraph running from Calcutta, maybe the map of India? Yeah. Running from Calcutta on the upper right, across to Agra, which is just below Delhi, all the way down to Bombay on that side, and then across the continent to Madras. In doing so, he and Dalhousie constructed the world's biggest telegraph. This is only 4 years after Samuel F.B. Morse strung 15 miles in Washington, D.C. This is across India, the first really major telegraph system in the world. For that event, O'Shaughnessy was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1856 and is remembered for